Something is happening right now between Washington and Tehran that goes far beyond the usual cycle of threats and counter-threats, and it carries the kind of weight that doesn't just shake markets or rattle diplomats. It fundamentally alters the trajectory of a confrontation that has been building for years and is now accelerating toward a point that very few people in power are willing to publicly acknowledge. Because the President of the United States has just issued one of the most aggressive energy-related military threats in modern American history, openly stating that he is prepared to obliterate Iran's energy sources, the very lifeline of its economy, the backbone of its government revenue, and the single most strategically sensitive infrastructure in the entire Middle East. And Iran's response was not silence, not panic, and not retreat. Tehran fired back, calling the American plan unrealistic, dismissive language that carries its own kind of danger, because when a nation facing an existential threat dismisses the threat itself, it signals either supreme confidence or a willingness to absorb the consequences. And either way, the world just moved closer to a kind of confrontation that no amount of diplomacy may be able to reverse. So picture this scene. A tense briefing room somewhere deep inside the Pentagon. Monitors displaying satellite imagery of Iran's Karg Island oil terminal, its sprawling refineries at Isfahan and Abadan, and the network of pipelines and pumping stations that together account for the majority of Iran's crude oil exports. And on the other side of the world, inside Tehran's security apparatus, strategists staring at the same maps, running the same calculations, but arriving at very different conclusions. Because according to CNN's latest reporting on the escalating standoff, Trump's threat to obliterate Iran's energy infrastructure represents a dramatic escalation in rhetoric that has moved the conversation from economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure to something that sounds far more like a prelude to direct military action. And the word obliterate is not a word that gets used casually in presidential communications, even by a president known for extreme language, because it implies total destruction, not degradation, not disruption, but annihilation of the infrastructure that keeps Iran's economy alive. And to understand why this threat is so significant, you need to understand what Iran's energy infrastructure actually represents. Because according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Iran holds the world's fourth largest proven crude oil reserves and the second largest natural gas reserves on the planet. And according to data compiled by the International Energy Agency, Iranian oil exports, even under heavy sanctions, have continued to flow through various channels, generating billions in revenue that funds not just the Iranian government's domestic operations, but also its regional military activities, its ballistic missile program, and its network of allied militias across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. And targeting that infrastructure is not like imposing another round of sanctions or freezing bank accounts. It is an act of economic warfare at a scale that would be felt not just in Tehran, but in Beijing, New Delhi, Tokyo, and every energy-dependent capital across the globe. Because Iran's oil doesn't just fuel Iran, it fuels global supply chains. And removing it from the market, whether through military strikes or the credible threat of strikes, sends a shockwave through every barrel of oil traded on every exchange in the world. And that shockwave is already being felt. Because according to Bloomberg's energy desk, crude oil futures spiked immediately following Trump's statement, with Brent crude surging past levels not seen in months as traders scrambled to price in the possibility that the world's most strategically located oil infrastructure could be taken offline by American military action. And according to analysis published by Goldman Sachs and cited by the Financial Times, a sustained disruption to Iranian oil exports, whether through strikes on infrastructure or a naval blockade of export terminals, could push global oil prices into territory that would trigger inflationary spirals across developed and developing economies alike. And this is not a hypothetical. This is what markets are pricing in right now, today, as the rhetoric between Washington and Tehran reaches a temperature that even hardened energy traders are calling unprecedented. And Iran's response to this threat is itself a critical piece of the puzzle, because according to reporting by Al Jazeera, senior Iranian officials dismissed Trump's plan as unrealistic, using language that was carefully chosen to project strength without directly escalating to a counter-threat. And according to statements carried by Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency and later analyzed by BBC Monitoring, Tehran's messaging centered on three key arguments. First, that Iran's energy infrastructure is too dispersed, too hardened, and too deeply embedded in civilian areas to be obliterated without catastrophic humanitarian consequences that the United States cannot afford politically. Second, that any attack on Iranian energy infrastructure would trigger immediate retaliatory strikes against U.S. military installations, allied bases, and critical energy infrastructure across the Gulf region, including facilities in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain that are essential to global oil supply. And third, that the international community, particularly China and Russia, would not stand by while a major energy supplier is destroyed, arguing that such an action would shatter whatever remains of the rules-based international order and accelerate the formation of an anti-American economic and military bloc. And each of these arguments carries weight, because according to a detailed assessment published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Iran has spent decades hardening and dispersing its critical infrastructure precisely in anticipation of this kind of threat, building underground facilities, establishing redundant systems, and embedding military assets within civilian population centers in ways that make surgical strikes extremely difficult without significant collateral damage. And according to analysis by the Brookings Institution, Iran's retaliatory capabilities, while not comparable to American firepower in scale, are specifically designed to target the vulnerabilities of the U.S. and its allies in the region, including naval vessels in the Persian Gulf, military bases in Iraq and Syria, and the oil infrastructure of Gulf Arab states that together produce a significant share of the world's daily crude output. And that asymmetric capability is what makes Iran's dismissal of Trump's threat not just bluster, but a calculated signal that Tehran believes it can impose costs high enough to deter action, or, if deterrence fails, to ensure that the consequences are shared rather than absorbed alone. And this is where the geopolitical dimension becomes impossible to separate from the military one. Because according to Reuters, China, which remains Iran's largest oil customer despite American sanctions, has responded to Trump's threat with carefully worded statements opposing unilateral military action and emphasizing the need for diplomatic solutions, language that diplomatic analysts interpret as a clear warning that Beijing views any American strike on Iranian energy infrastructure as a direct threat to its own economic security. And according to the South China Morning Post, Chinese officials have privately communicated to Washington through back channels that an attack on Iran's oil sector would be treated as a hostile act against Chinese economic interests, raising the specter of economic retaliation that could range from accelerated de-dollarization efforts to restrictions on critical mineral exports that American technology companies depend on. And Russia, according to TASS, and later confirmed by reporting from the Moscow Times, has been even more explicit, with senior officials stating that any military action against Iran would fundamentally alter the strategic balance in the region and could trigger responses that extend well beyond the Middle East. And while great powers maneuver, the human dimension of this crisis is already becoming visible. Because according to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Iran's civilian population of nearly 90 million people is already under severe economic strain from years of sanctions, inflation, and currency devaluation. And according to Médecins Sans Frontières, the Iranian healthcare system, which was already struggling to maintain critical services, would face catastrophic collapse if energy infrastructure, which powers hospitals, water treatment plants, and food distribution networks, were targeted or destroyed. And this humanitarian reality is not a footnote to the strategic analysis. It is the core of the moral question that lawmakers, military planners, and citizens around the world must confront, because obliterating a nation's energy sources is not a surgical operation against a military target. It is, by definition, an act that targets the systems that keep civilians alive. And international humanitarian law, as codified in the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, specifically prohibits attacks on objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, including infrastructure necessary for the production and distribution of energy, water, and food. And this legal dimension is now being raised forcefully by members of Congress. Because according to reporting by Politico, lawmakers from both parties have demanded classified briefings on the legal basis for any potential military action against Iran, questioning whether the president has the constitutional authority to order strikes of this magnitude without explicit congressional authorization. And according to CNN's congressional correspondent, senior senators have invoked the War Powers Resolution, arguing that an attack on Iran's energy infrastructure would constitute an act of war that requires legislative approval, a position that has gained support even among Republicans who have traditionally deferred to executive authority on national security matters. And this constitutional confrontation is not new, but the stakes have never been higher, because the scope of what Trump is threatening goes beyond anything contemplated by previous presidents in their confrontations with Iran, including the targeted killing of Qasem Soleimani, which itself triggered intense debate about executive war powers. And the regional implications of this confrontation extend far beyond the bilateral relationship between Washington and Tehran. Because according to analysis published by Foreign Affairs, any military action against Iran's energy infrastructure would immediately destabilize the entire Persian Gulf region, triggering a chain of consequences that would affect Iraq, where Iranian-backed militias maintain significant political and military influence, Syria, where Iranian forces and their allies remain deeply embedded, Lebanon, where Hezbollah's arsenal represents a direct threat to Israeli population centers, and Yemen, where Iranian-supported Houthi forces have already demonstrated the ability to strike commercial shipping and Saudi oil facilities. And according to the International Crisis Group, the interconnected nature of these conflicts means that a strike on Iran would not produce an isolated response, but a region-wide escalation that could draw in multiple state and non-state actors, each with their own calculations, grievances, and red lines. And the energy market implications deserve their own layer of analysis, because they affect every person on the planet who drives a car, heats a home, or buys food that was transported by vehicles running on petroleum-based fuel. Because according to the International Energy Agency's latest assessment, the global oil market is already operating with historically thin spare capacity, meaning that any significant disruption to supply, whether from Iranian production going offline or from retaliatory attacks on Gulf state infrastructure, would produce price shocks that central banks are poorly positioned to absorb. And according to a scenario analysis published by J.P. Morgan and cited by the Wall Street Journal, a full-scale disruption of Iranian exports combined with even partial damage to Saudi or Emirati production could push oil prices to levels that would trigger recession in multiple major economies simultaneously. And this economic dimension is what separates Trump's threat from previous confrontations with Iran, because the global economy in its current state, still recovering from multiple shocks and dealing with persistent inflation, cannot absorb an energy crisis of this magnitude without consequences that would be felt by ordinary citizens in every country, regardless of their proximity to the conflict. And this is where the strategic incoherence of the threat becomes apparent to analysts who are watching closely. Because according to a detailed assessment by the Atlantic Council, obliterating Iran's energy infrastructure would not just punish Tehran, it would punish the global economy, alienate allies who depend on stable energy supplies, accelerate the very de-dollarization trends that threaten American economic dominance, and create a humanitarian catastrophe that would generate decades of anti-American sentiment across the Muslim world. And according to former senior Pentagon officials quoted by the New York Times, military planners have consistently warned that strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure would produce short-term tactical gains, but long-term strategic disasters, because destroyed infrastructure can be rebuilt, but destroyed relationships, shattered alliances, and radicalized populations persist for generations. And this tension between the political appeal of tough rhetoric and the strategic reality of its consequences is what has historically prevented American presidents from following through on threats of this magnitude, even when they had the military capability to do so. And yet here we are, in a moment where the gap between rhetoric and action appears to be narrowing. Because according to CNN's latest reporting from Pentagon sources, military planning for various Iran contingencies has accelerated in recent weeks, with options ranging from targeted strikes on nuclear facilities to broader campaigns against energy and military infrastructure being briefed to senior officials at increasing frequency. And according to satellite imagery analyzed by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and published by Reuters, there has been a notable increase in American military assets positioned within striking distance of Iranian territory, including carrier strike groups, bomber squadrons, and refueling aircraft, a buildup that goes beyond routine deployment patterns and suggests active preparation for potential operations. And Iran, according to reporting by Al Jazeera's Military Analysis Unit, has responded with its own preparations, dispersing mobile missile launchers, activating air defense networks, and placing its naval forces in the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz on their highest alert level, moves that further reduce the margin for error and increase the risk of accidental escalation. And this mutual preparation is what makes the current moment so terrifying to people who study conflict for a living. Because according to analysis published by the Rand Corporation, the most dangerous phase of any military confrontation is not the decision to fight, but the period immediately before that decision. When both sides are positioned for action, intelligence is incomplete, communication is limited, and a single miscalculation, a misidentified radar signature, a drone that strays too close, a naval vessel that crosses an invisible line, can trigger a chain of events that neither side intended and neither side can stop. And that is precisely the phase we appear to be entering right now. And the fact that both Washington and Tehran are publicly downplaying the risk of war while privately preparing for it is itself the most alarming indicator, because it means that the public conversation and the operational reality have diverged. And when that divergence reaches a critical point, events tend to move faster than statements, briefings, or diplomatic cables can manage. And for everyone watching this unfold, whether from Washington, Tehran, London, Beijing, or anywhere else on a planet that runs on oil and depends on stability, the question is no longer whether this confrontation will have consequences, but how severe those consequences will be and who will bear the greatest cost. Because wars do not distribute their costs equally. They fall hardest on civilians, on the poorest, on the most vulnerable, on the people who had no voice in the decisions that brought violence to their lives. And the language of obliteration, however politically useful it may be in a domestic context, carries a weight that transcends politics because it describes the intentional destruction of the systems that keep millions of people alive. And that weight should be felt by every decision-maker, every lawmaker, every voter, and every citizen who believes that the measure of a nation's power is not its ability to destroy, but its willingness to restrain that ability when destruction serves no purpose beyond spectacle and dominance. And this is where the story ultimately rests. Not in the threat itself, not in the dismissal of that threat, but in the space between them, the narrow and shrinking space where diplomacy still has a chance to function, where back channels still carry messages, where mediators still shuttle between capitals, and where the possibility of a different outcome still exists, however faintly. Because according to European diplomatic sources cited by France 24, there are ongoing efforts, quiet, fragile, and deeply uncertain, to establish a framework for de-escalation that would address both American concerns about Iran's nuclear and military activities and Iranian demands for sanctions relief and security guarantees. And whether those efforts succeed or fail will depend not on rhetoric, but on choices made by leaders who must decide whether their legacy will be defined by the wars they started or the wars they prevented. And history, which is patient and unforgiving, will remember not the threats that were made, but the decisions that followed. And right now, in this moment, those decisions are still being made, and the world is watching, holding its breath, and hoping that the space between threat and action remains wide enough for reason to survive. Because once that space closes, it rarely opens again without a cost that no headline can capture and no generation can forget.